Alright, when you first start learning web development, you tend to use pixel for everything, your height, your width, the font size, margin. But as you grow and begin to learn about responsive design, you realize that you have to change some units. Now, knowing how to use CSS units effectively is a core CSS skill. So in this tutorial, I'm going to take you through other CSS units that you should be using beside pixel, and I'll explain what they are, when and where to use them. So please, at the end of this video, if you think the video is helpful, please hit the like button, and if you have anything to say about any part of the video, just leave a comment, and if you're new, please consider subscribing. Alright, the first one here is the absolute versus relative. Now, the absolute units, they are basically units you're familiar with even before you started learning web development. They are units with real world equivalents like your centimeters, your meter, and all those stuff. Now, but in CSS, when we talk about absolute units, we refer to those units that always stay the same size regardless of the context in which they appear. And the most common one is the pixel. Now, the pixel is about 0.01 inch. And the pixel is very simple and it's quite straightforward, and that's probably why you find yourself using it all the time. But the problem with a pixel is that it is too rigid, too fixed for pages that we kind of need to adapt to a variety of screen sizes and user preference, and that's why we try to move away from using pixel for everything to a more fluid and responsive units, and these are the relative units. So having said that, the pixel is also very important because there are elements in our page that we actually want to stay same size regardless of the context or the screen size. And secondly, border and some other stuff are kind of more appropriate in pixel. Now, the relative units, they are units based on the size of something else, and it's usually either the default text size or the size of the parent element. So this way they are more fluid and more responsive. And the most common or the most used relative units in CSS are the percentage, viewport height, viewport width, the ephemeral unit popularly called M, and the root ephemeral unit popularly called rem. Alright, I'm going to start with M and rem. Now basically the M and rem, they are used for the font size, and they are the same thing, the difference being that M is relative to the parent element while rem is relative to the HTML element or the root element. Now the value for M and rem is actually equal to the default root font size of the browser, and we know that the default root font size of modern browsers is actually 16 pixel. So when I go to my settings here, you'll see that the default font size is actually 16 pixel. Now there's actually a cool thing with the rem and M, and that is the fact that it gives the user the ability to actually control the font size of the web page from the browser settings. Let's say I want to increase this. Now when I go to my settings and change this to, let's say, 30 pixel, when I go back, you'll notice that the font size has changed. Now this is a very cool feature since we have a wide variety of users. There are people who can really see tiny things, so they can easily change the font size from the browser settings. Now this is not possible with the pixel, because when I come here and change my paragraph, give it a value of 10 pixel. Now when I go back and reload my page, you'll notice that you can see the font size has changed and it is 10 pixel, and you can see that the root font size here is 10 pixel. So whether or not I go to my settings and actually change this to, let's say, 9 pixel, you'll see that when I go back, nothing changes. the root, when I reload, you can see it's still 10 pixel and the root element is 10 pixel. Now you understand what we mean when we said that the pixel is rigid. Now the basic difference with the rem and m is what I said earlier, which is what they are relative to. Now when I go back to my code, you will notice that I'm going to change this back to 1 rem. Now you will notice that the parents of these three paragraphs, they have different values, and yet all my paragraphs have the same font size. Now that's because the rem is relative only to the HTML document itself. So when I go to my HTML document and change this to 2 rem, notice that when I go back to my code, the font size is going to change. So this is really cool because it gives you it makes it very easy for you to control the overall font size of the web page just by changing the value from the HTML elements. Now when I change this to M, leaving it the way it is, 1M, now I'm going to leave everything the way it is here. I'm just going to remove the R. Now you're going to notice that the paragraphs, they're going to have different font sizes. Now this is because the M is relative to the parent. You can see all the paragraphs, they have different font sizes. Now that's because they've all inherited the font size of their parents and not the HTML document itself. Now you can see that when I inspect these paragraphs individually, you'll notice that the first paragraph here has a value of 1M and the computed value is 16 pixel, while the second paragraph still has the value of 1M but the computed value is 32 pixel. That's because it has inherited the font size of the parent, which is 2M, and 2M is equal to 32 pixel. And same is true for the third paragraph, which is you can see the paragraph is still 1M but it inherited the font size of the parent, which is 48 pixel, being 3 times 16. So that's the thing with rem and m. So I've explained what they are, so whenever you need these features in your browsers, you can easily. Alright, next I want to talk about percentage, viewport height, and viewport width. Now we use this units to set either the height of the page or the width of the page. Now in my HTML document here, I have two divs here, one has a child and one does not, and in my CSS file I've given the same width and height to both the child and the other div. Now when I go back to my page and reload, you'll notice that the width and height of these black bars, they are the same irrespective of the fact that this one is actually in a container. And when I try to reduce the width of the web page, you'll notice that nothing really changes. Now this is because the pixel unit is actually a fixed unit. Now when I go back and change the width of these two to, let's say, 50%, you'll notice that the two bars will not have the same width again, and that's because the percentage is actually a relative unit. So when I save and go back to my browser, you will notice that the width of the two is not the same. Now the first one is now 50% relative to the width of the container, while the second one is 50% relative to the width of the web page. And you'll also notice that as I try to reduce the width of the page, you can see that this other one reduces. Now that's because it is a responsive unit. Now there is also another unit that you can use to set your width, and that is the viewport width. So when I set this to 100 viewport width, now the viewport width is similar to percentage, and 1% is equal to 1 viewport width, and 20% is equal to 20 viewport width, and 100% is equal to 100 viewport width. So when I save and go back to my browser, you'll notice that they are all 100% of their parent elements. Now there's something else you'll notice. You'll see there is a space here, and that is the problem with using viewport width. Now if the page extends, that's whenever there is a scroll bar, now the width of the viewport width tends to be larger than the width of the HTML document, and that is why it is advised when setting the width of your web page not to use viewport width. Now when I go back and change this to 100%, you will notice that the space will no longer be there. So when I save and go back to my browser, you will notice that that little space is no longer there, and that's why the percentage is best for setting the viewport width. Now the last one is the viewport height, and this is basically the best when it comes to setting the height of your web page. Now when I go to the height of my container and change this to, let's say, 40%. Now when I save and go back to my browser and reload, you'll notice that the container disappears. Now this is because the percentage is actually a relative element, and here the height of your page cannot really be estimated, so it does not know 40% of what. But when I go back to my body and set the viewport, let's say 100 viewport height, when I save and reload, you notice that this container is going to be 40% of this 100 viewport height. So in order to avoid this little problems, we tend to use the viewport height for all our heights. So when I come here and set this to 40 viewport height, is going to be the same. You can see it's going to be 40 viewport height irrespective of the height of the body. So even when I remove this and save, you'll notice that it's going to stay the same. That's because you can see it's going to stay the same. Now this is why it is advised to use the viewport height to set your height and the percentage to set your width.